The next upcoming Member Connect calls, if you speak Portuguese, like Jimmy McVegas and Clovis and the folks from Portugal on the call, August 13th at 10 a.m. in Brasilia, we'll have a call with the Bahia State Tourism representatives, including their LGBT marketing manager. That's 9 a.m. for Miami, Toronto, and New York. That's 3 p.m. for Berlin, Rome, and Cape Town. And then on August 20th, we will shift over to the Indian Ocean to have a discussion with the folks from the Seychelles. So I've never been there, and it's certainly somewhere I'd love to go. So I'll be listening in on that. And again, that's August 20th. All that information is on the Members Connect. So on behalf of IGLTA staff and our board, we have our board chair from the association, John Munoz, is on the call. Welcome, John. We'd like to thank and welcome Dougal Mckenzie for doing today's call, because his information that he did share with us maybe 2 months ago was really valuable, and there was a lot of excitement about it. So we brought him back to give some new updates. He is the industry head of travel at Google. He's based in New York City. He's a Kiwi. He's from New Zealand, spent time in Sydney as well. And he's really been a great partner to IGLTA and involved Google in many ways. One that I would like to recognize and thank him in particular for is hosting and helping me with the annual think tank that we've started. We host that at Google each year, and that's just an amazing opportunity for us, and we appreciate the partnership with Google on that. He and his husband are outdoor enthusiasts, from skiing to beaching to Provincetown. See him online in P-Town quite often. I'm jealous. So without any further ado, welcome Mr. Dougal from Google. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much. Hey, I'm going to look back and forward two ways, and if I am, it's not me doing something else. I've got you on this screen, and I've got the content straight ahead of me, so forgive me for that. Thank you, John, and thanks to the IGLTA for giving me the opportunity to come and talk today. John mentioned, you know, I'm born in New Zealand, although I spent a lot of my life in Australia, and I now live here in New York City. And so if I speak a little quickly, or if I just have a few words that I say strangely, please yell out, let me know and interrupt me, and I promise to try and reframe them or say them a little slower and less thickly if I do talk too quickly or anything like that. I manage our travel business here in New York, and I've done so for about 5 years, either here or in Australia and New Zealand before. And I spend my time working with partners on how they can adapt and understand and stay ahead of consumer changes, and how they can connect with them from a digital standpoint. And so I'm going to use a number of different pieces of data today in similar ways that I did a couple of months ago with you. Some of the data will look similar. Some of the data will look a little bit different. Understand that in each of the cases, the data is, of course, fresher and looking at the changes that we've seen since then. So I hope that helps and makes sense. I'm going to dive into it. Look, one of the things I do, and I'm going to dive on down, there's a number of different pieces of data that I said I'm going to do. I'm going to break it into about, let me just bring this over here for a second, my apologies. I'm going to break it into about 3 parts. I'm going to start off by talking largely around sentiment data. These are surveys that we run to understand people's willingness and intent to travel. Think of that as like a leading indicator and their propensity, or as I said, willingness to travel at a future time. Then I'm going to kind of dive a little deeper and actually look at query data. So the actual data that we see of people searching for and the interest that they're showing us and the changes that that brings. And then lastly, I actually want to spend a little bit of time on some consumer behavioral changes and some of the anthropological factors that are changing as a result of COVID-19 and how we see that changing through. So 3 different parts. Again, put your hand up or yell out if you've got a question as we go through that relevant, I should say, to the data or to the slide. But I will try and do my best to have some time at the end to make sure any general questions can be answered then. Sound okay? So on that, look, you know, before I dive into the first set of data, here's the thing I do want to say. For the sentiment data, at least for the first few pieces of this data, I'm going to intentionally use one market and use the US for that. My promise is that all the data is not American, in fact, quite the opposite. And I'll try and be as expansive as I can across different regions, different markets, and show a level of specificity. But for the purpose of the sentiment, it makes more sense to choose one large market and to use that to create the point and the message that I'm trying to show you. So early on, it'll be American specific for a couple of slides. It is for an intent and a message. But one thing I would say to you is this: the story holds true regardless of the geography or the consumer or traveler that we interviewed. So the story and the message holds true regardless of the geography, but I'll use America to help to show that to start with. So what you can see on the screen at the moment is travel intent is closely linked to the current health status of the geography and the subsequent restrictions that a government might be putting in place. Let me explain how this slide works. You've got two lines across the graph. The solid blue line is those who are unlikely to travel in the next 2 weeks. We're not going to look at that too much. The dashed blue line is those who are unlikely to travel in the next 3 months. And I want to show you the point behind this. If you cast your eyes to the left, what you see is that 3/4 of those we surveyed said that in the next 3 months, they would not be willing to travel. As we started to flatten the curves, as we started to get somewhat on top of the virus, or at least assumed we had, you started to see this increased likelihood of people being willing to travel. Those numbers got down to the 50s. And so whilst it was still a little over 50% unlikely to travel, we were starting to get far more people open to the idea of travel again. As I'm sure many of you know, the resurgence in this country across the Sun Belt, from Florida through to California, has started to see those numbers rise again. And we see that in some way matched by now a less likelihood or a decrease in willingness to travel, as it's gone from the 50s back to the mid 60s in terms of people's unlikeliness to travel. If I looked at this exact same set of data for Europe, for example, we actually saw a far greater improvement. As they really did get on top of it, we saw these numbers come down and actually go below the 50% mark. In other words, more people were willing to travel than not. But as we start to look at the most recent set of data, as we start to see a lift again in places like Spain and in Germany, we're seeing these numbers start to rise again. So the message I would give you on this slide is simple. The state of COVID-19 in the country, the restrictions that follow, are matched very closely in people's willingness in future intent and future travel, and will continue to be so for as long as we stay through this.
Hey, Dougal.
Yeah.
We had an attendee just pop up there, present now, which knocked you off. So if you can reshare that again.
Oh, did you see resume presenting? How's that?
Yep, it's back. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So hopefully you saw some of that. Did the slides stay up for most of that then? Yeah, good. I can see people nodding. Okay, so look, this is mirrored in the reason why people won't travel. The main portion through this shows that, as you would expect, the primary reason in about March, when this sort of kicked off in this country, right, was the primary reason, 50-odd%, was because of coronavirus. Over time, as our comfort level improved, and as we started to again flatten the curve somewhat in many parts of the country, we saw that drop back and people become more comfortable, and that was less of the primary reason. It's now popped back up again, and that's again mirrored in what we see, particularly again, as I said, through the Sun Belt of this country, through the southern states. By the way, the bottom, there's a couple of graphs along the bottom, a couple of circles. If you look at the first and the second, logistics and finances, they're of course quite closely related in many ways to the fact that coronavirus has made logistics to travel harder and made finances for many more difficult. And so whilst different, 23% of that and another 50% for coronavirus itself are incredibly closely related. Oh, on the graph, here we go. And I want to kind of break that down slightly and help you understand too that this varies somewhat depending on the age bracket that a traveler will sit within. I've broken it into above and below 45 for simplicity of this. The yellow lines are the dashed lines. The yellow dashed line is over 45. The blue dashed line is under 45. And again, the solid yellow line is over 45 3 months out, and the solid blue line is under 45 3 months out. The message you take from this is, in all instances, those who are younger are slightly more willing to travel and to consider travel in the future. I can see some questions popping up here. I'll look that way if need be, but shout out if it's something you need me to do. That actually becomes even more pronounced when we look at something like flying, right? And so those who are under 45 diverge more noticeably from those over 45 in their willingness to fly in the coming months further out. Does that make sense? I caught my first flight back at the end of June, my first flight since March. It was a very good experience. And in fact, I caught my second flight last week, and it was also a very good experience. So I'm one of these, although barely under 45, so maybe not that, but I'm one of these people who's willing to fly. Hey, I want to kind of break that down just a little bit and show you this for a number of different markets, because it helps to prove the point I made before about how closely correlated the health status of a country is with the willingness to travel. And what we saw is domestic travel intent bounce back quite quickly in countries that flattened the curve, right? We saw Europe get on top of it for a period of time, and perhaps still in many instances. And you can see there a country like Italy, for example, where almost half of Italians said they would travel within the next 3 months. Whereas if you compare that to, for example, Latin America, still deep within this crisis, far fewer willing to travel in the near term. Canada and America, of course, are good countries to compare in this. Canada really has done a very good job of this, far greater propensity and likelihood to travel. America, far less. So this continues that theme where the health status matches the ability to travel very closely. Those were domestic travel numbers. I should have pointed that out. This is domestic travel numbers. You're going to see this theme come through quite a lot in the data I present. And actually, it's one of the messages I will give you is to focus on domestic travel, because when we look at it from an international standpoint, all those numbers become far less. And the desire of people to travel overseas is far less than it is domestically. So that's all from a sentiment data point of view. I want to now break it down into actual query data, the data of people searching on Google versus the surveys which provided the data for the last lot. Here's the first slide on this that I want to share with you. Globally, and this is global data, all travel queries, we're starting to see an improvement. I'm going to explain the data points to you because otherwise it becomes quite confusing. So let me explain it to you, but I don't need you to go too deep into it. The blue line is queries over a 5-day rolling average. In other words, it takes out any random peculiarities that you might see. A year-on-year change in travel intent over the last a few weeks. So what you see when you look at this is at the start of the period, right, we were seeing 40% less queries in travel globally than we were a year prior. We're now seeing about 18% less queries than we were a year ago. For the queries to be only 18% lower than a year ago is an incredibly positive sign. The red lines simply look at a 5-day period versus a 5-day period before, and really it just shows us when we start to see more minute and more granular changes as it picks up above a certain level. So this number that I want you to focus on is the blue line, and that rise and gradual improvement in people searching for and looking at travel. The numbers actually vary quite noticeably. We're down around 28% year on year for the United States, for example. In contrast, Europe is up year on year. We are seeing more people searching for travel in Europe now than we did a year ago before COVID happened, which is a huge change. So if I show you that, for example, you see it here. The red line, or the line where the red bars are, I should say, forms at 0. And you can see that blue line tracked from about 25% minus up to what I said before, plus 10% now. And so we're seeing that line lift up. And again, we're seeing more positive or more travel queries and more travel interest than we did 12 months prior. And it changes by region, right? So that line you just saw for Europe, that's now shown in that red line on this graph. And we saw that go up to the 10% number I showed you. The interesting thing I'd take from all of this is Most of the numbers are starting to glide up and towards the right a little bit. Two exceptions to that. Latin America has stayed largely flat. Right? Latin America has hardly had any real increase and sits at around half the queries that we saw a year ago. And the other one that I would look at is APAC, which is the blue line, which lifted for a prolonged period of time, but has actually been falling off in the last 2, 3, 4 weeks. That fall off in the last few weeks is coming primarily from Japan, Thailand, and Australia. And if, like me, you followed the news in Australia, they've seen a surge in the state of Victoria. They've closed their state borders, at least from a land standpoint, and even largely from an air standpoint. And we're seeing that match through in some of the data as well. Sound good so far? I can see nodding if I look this way, and I'll keep looking at you this way. Hey, now, I'm going to go down a little bit deeper. I'm going to start off by region, and then I hope I don't kind of be too laborious for you. I'm actually going to go down to by country level. I'm not going to labor through each of the countries. I'm going to allow you to look at the countries. Some will be of interest to you, some clearly won't be. Let me explain what each of these graphs is going to look like and what each of the data points is going to show, so you can quickly look your way through them as we do it. This is destination queries by region. Let me explain what destination means. It is a particular geography or country. So let's use Greece as an example. It could be someone in America searching for travel to Greece, or it could be someone searching for travel to Mykonos as a place within Greece. I choose that as my favorite place in the world. Or it could be someone within Greece searching for travel within Greece as well, right? Or one of the locations there. And that's particularly important because actually a lot of the interest, a disproportionate amount of the interest, is driven by domestic-based queries. That's the first thing to take from this. Second, I'm using hotels as a proxy, right? Hotels is such a significant category within travel, it becomes a proxy for the travel intent in a region. So don't think of it so much as just hotels as travel overall, because the numbers hold true for the intent and the interest levels. 3, black is 2019 queries. Blue is this year's 2020 queries. 4, you'll see things like seasonality play out. So if you look at the top left, the top two, North America and Europe, I should say, it starts from day 1, January the 1st, and it moves through to today. What are we, about 260 days into the year, something around that level. So it moves into today's date. Right? What you see is that seasonality a little bit. You see, for example, if you look at Europe, as you'd expect, we see summer pick up, right? And the queries pick up towards summer. That makes sense. If you look at CALA in the bottom right, we see the opposite of that because, of course, as they head away from summer, it drops back somewhat. So that's why you see differences in the curves. But I'd take this from it. The black line is atypical for what we would see in any given year, be that 2019 or a year prior. The blue line, of course, is clearly not typical, and it's heavily impacted by coronavirus. We see the fall off in America when the borders got shut, when the stay-at-home orders happened, and we see the rise as those borders have started to open up within the country, as the stay-at-home orders have started to close, started to be reduced, and we see that lift back up. If you look at Europe, for example, we're back almost. So what is Carla? Sorry, Central and Latin America. My apologies, LATAM. And in fact, my sincere apologies. I'll actually use LATAM sometimes and Carla other times. So interchange those two. Call it anything south of the United States. In Europe, in the middle there, you can see the queries we're seeing are back neck and neck with what we saw last year in this category. And in fact, you know, I saw before, in all categories, we actually saw a slight improvement year on year in Europe. In contrast, that is not happening in the Middle East and Africa. It's happening somewhat in APAC, but as I said before, it's falling back off again, driven by Thailand, Japan, and Australia. And then Carla's remained, or Latin America has remained relatively flat. And again, that's representative of the state of the health crisis in that region. So I am going to show country by country. I'm not going to go and talk through each and every one because it would take too long and it would be too laborious for you. So really, you look to the countries that make sense to you, and I will point out a few things on a few of them. So for example,
Do you want to take any questions at this point?
Well, if you have questions, shout them out as we go, and I'll point out a few things to show you, right? It's worth looking at Italy, where you see those numbers, where you see the interest now greater than a year ago. Right?
Does anybody have a question at this point? Quiet group, okay.
Cool. I'll go through this, and we've got questions at the end, and I can always come back to these slides.
Sure.
But Italy is an example of where travel intent in that country, we don't do the actual bookings. We don't do any bookings as a company ourselves. Right? Even with our Hotel Ads product, where we do a small amount of facilitated bookings, we're never the merchant of record. Therefore, we don't retain or know the bookings. So no. On the second slide, a few different ones to show you. Yeah, Israel actually in the last couple of weeks, a huge spike in interest and intent to travel in that market. On the bottom there, I've highlighted with a yellow star Norway. Let me explain why. It is the one country where the color coding for 2020 2019 has in fact flipped. It's flipped for one reason, and that is net for the period of time shown there. It's actually ahead for the whole year. So in other words, it's the one country where we are seeing more searches for the year to date this year than we did the year before. Every other country is still net behind for the year to date. So that's why that is flipped, and that's why I've starred that one. You see South Africa, for example, bottom right. Again, I point out Southern Hemisphere, therefore the curve in black looks slightly different than you would expect to see in a Northern Hemisphere country. And of course, you've seen the fall off from COVID, and you're yet to see any true pickup in the interest there from that.
Hey, Dougal, I do have a question.
Yes, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. So this is really insightful, really helpful. So on each of these national queries, hotel queries, are these in the instance of, let me pick one, when you said Italy and the queries are up, is it for travel just within Italy, or is that all travel, global travel, and their queries coming from Italy?
Good question. Sorry, I tried to explain at the start, but I probably wasn't clear enough. So this is Italy as a destination, right? So it is hotels in Italy, whether that be someone just searching for example, hotels in Italy, or whether that might be hotels in Rome or hotels in a particular part of Rome, whether that query comes from someone in Italy, an Italian themselves, or whether they happen to come from me in New York City searching for that. In this case, all the queries are the destination versus the user's location. The user's location might be in Italy or it might not be, but it's the destination that is what's relevant here.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. And look, I'm actually going to show you a user slide in a moment for a different reason. But in this case, I think it's more relevant to look at the market as a destination than the traveler themselves. Now, what I can tell you is though,
Dougal, can you, I'm sorry to interrupt, can you, because we have 8 graphs here, can you give us a sense of, for USA, how far are the queries, what is that percentage between this year and last year as most recently? Is that like a 20% difference that we're still down about 20-25%?
So that's what you, hopefully, depending on how small it is on your screen, is what you should be able to see. So let me show you this. All the numbers are indexed, right? We index everything because we don't share raw data, okay? And so that's why there's an index number, and we index each country to itself based on a 100 point at some point in the data set or in the previous data set. So what you see on the USA is the black line 2019 sits kind of in the mid, what is that, 60s at the start, gets up towards 100 as we start to head into summer in the Northern Hemisphere in the United States. If we look at the green line, we started this year with more people searching than they did a year ago, hence the green line is above for a period of time, right? They cross, let's face it, it's about March the 13th, something like that, that they cross when that fell off, and it drops all the way down to 25. So versus the 75, we're seeing 50% less queries than we did a year ago, and they're now catching back up to being around that 28% less queries that I mentioned before. Does that help to explain that?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Beautiful. Cool. I'll show a couple more just to kind of keep moving through this. And again, I didn't want to labor too much on it. On the bottom, you see that southern hemisphere factor, right? You see not only the flow of the black lines, in other words, falling from summer through to winter, but you see the flatness in the green. In other words, no real improvement in the markets there from a travel standpoint. And lastly, I'll finish with just a few of the APAC markets, and I've highlighted China, and I'll come to that in a moment. Look, I will point at New Zealand, right? It's an example, seeing as I come from that, it's a country that has done a fairly good job, or a very good job with coronavirus. And as a result, travel now in that market is actually back above where it was a year ago, travel intent. And again, you know, something I started to mention before, and I should really stress again, is we are seeing far greater portion of queries for a destination coming from the destination themselves, domestic queries, than we would in a normal, any kind of non-COVID year. And so far more of travel is coming from the domestic market. And for anyone on this call, I would highly drive you to think about your domestic traveler more so than you might even normally. China, by the way, I've started for a reason. We don't have data from the China market within the market, right? We don't operate in China. So in this case, it's only folks who might be thinking about traveling to China. Given what I just said about domestic queries being a disproportionately large portion of these data at the moment, it's not really that representative. And so China is probably not quite a good data set to look at for this particularly. Cool. Hey, I'm actually going to go back a slide because I don't want to scare you before I show you this next slide. You're going to be tempted to look at line by line. You're going to be tempted to look for a market that makes sense to you. And I actually don't want you to do that, right? I don't want you to look at any of that. I want to show you it to prove the point I made about domestic being your focus versus intra-regional or inter-regional. By the way, what I haven't done in this presentation is gone state by state within the US. I have that sort of data, and if that's relevant, and I know it is for many folks, I can bring state by state. I just didn't want to make it too US centric by going for each and every state in the country. So let me explain this before you have a slight heart attack about what the data shows. Don't worry about the data points. Don't worry about the countries down the columns, down the rows. Look at it this way. 3 pillars: domestic travel, intra-regional, for example, someone going from Italy to Greece within the region, or inter-regional, someone coming from the US to Italy out of the region. Makes sense? Here's the point I want you to take. Here's the point I would like you to take. If you look at the left, I've stack ranked all 3 columns by the year-on-year change. And if you look at the fourth of the columns of each of the pillars, you see one thing that should stand out to you. There's lots of green in the year-on-year change of domestic. There's very little in intra-regional, and there's even less in inter-regional. So that kind of reinforces my point before, that the travel we are seeing at the moment is being driven by domestic within country travel, or some level of intra-regional, but very, very little inter-regional. That will continue so long as the health crisis continues the way it is. Couple last slides very, very quickly for you before I move into some consumer behavior. I'm conscious of time, and I also want to make sure I have time for any of the questions you have. I want to break that down by the type of travel query that people are looking at. For each of these, I'm going to look at things like destination activities, dining, rentals, in this case is vacation rentals, holiday homes, Airbnb, that sort of thing. Holidays is packaged holidays, much bigger in parts of Europe than it is in other markets. Car rental, cruise, bus and rail, air, and hotel. They're the categories. I'm going to apologize up front. When my analyst pulled these for me, the color coding changes on each of the slides. So I'm my sincere apologies that you can't just know that yellow will be rentals, for example, on each slide. It changes, and I didn't get a chance to flip that back and get it corrected. So apologies for that. Here's the message to take. In North America, and by the way, in most of the regions that I'm about to show you, vacation rentals, holiday homes, has been the primary driver of much of the lift. So if you look at the slide in the middle, there's the 0%, right? So this is queries year on year, and 0 being flat, So what you can see is vacation rentals for the last month or so has been up between 50 and even as high as about 80% year on year. That is a huge improvement and a huge growth in people looking for vacation rentals. Why? It's the safety and it's the distancing that people are searching for. But we're starting to see a number of other ones lift up and get close to being back to where they were a year ago, being back in that kind of -10, -20 zone. And in particular, it's car rentals and hotels in the US. Those are the biggest ones there. If I look at that for Europe, for example, now in this case, the green line, again, my apologies, is the vacation rentals. Same though, well above 40%, driving the lift. But here you're seeing more categories above that 0% line. You're seeing holidays. Holidays, particularly in Germany and the UK, are a big portion and a larger driver of the market, along with hotels and again, car rental lifting that section up. If I do the same for Latin America, Carla, should have used one terminology, everything's below 100%. Everything's below -20%. But again, it's vacation rentals first, followed by car rentals second. And so those same ones are lifting it up as well. Those are the ones that are driving that change. In Africa, we're well below the 25. We're kind of in that 30%. Same on vacation rentals and on car rentals. In the Middle East, we've got a few things popping up above zero. Again, driven by, not so much in this case, I should say, by vacation rentals, more so actually by car rental and a little bit from a holidays and hotel standpoint. And then lastly in APAC, everything's below zero, but a similar message and a similar theme coming through with a drop off in the last few weeks as things start to turn a little bit in some of the markets there. Pause for a second, and then I'm going to shift gears. Cool. Again, I've got time at the end for questions. I want to finish on a few points around consumer behavioral changes. So nothing to do with that data, although it is fed from data from Google, is what's driving the commentary that I'm going to make. Here's what we've noticed. We've seen behaviors in one of three particular forms. Right? We see a shock, which is that sudden change in consumer behavior, but it's not sustained. It goes back to where it was. We see a step change, where there's a sudden change in behavior, and we think it will sustain, or at least sustain for the period of COVID-19. And then a speed up, which is an acceleration of behavior we were already starting to see, and again, may sustain, at least for the foreseeable future, at least for the duration of COVID-19. Let me give you some examples. Cancellations is a good one, right? We saw the shock of cancellations, but we've seen that pull back off. I'm showing you these, by the way, because we've seen different companies react in different ways, and I would urge you to think about the changes we're seeing and react to them in the appropriate way, depending on how we see those sustain and where the change comes from. Cancellation is a good example of a shock change. A couple of examples of companies, and I know there are many examples of companies that have reacted to this. Delta and Royal Caribbean in this case, right, as did most companies, changed the flexibility, changed their cancellation, and ensured there was messaging in market around how to help consumers feel confident in that shock period of time. The step change example is virtual tours that I've used. We've seen a 20-fold increase in virtual tour demand in Google searches since the COVID-19 kicked in. And of course, we've seen companies and we've seen destinations react accordingly. Destination or Visit Greece in the bottom right and Airbnb, bottom left, I should say, and Airbnb in the bottom right are two examples of companies that have pivoted to try and capitalize on or find opportunities within that step change opportunity. And the third is the speed up, right? And we'll have all seen this thing like the remote work, and you can see the blue spike in the right has gone through the roof in people's understanding and consideration around the fact that they can work from anywhere. In fact, we've got a hypothesis, and we've been talking this with a few different partners, around the fact that in America, for example, we're going to have Thanksgiving at the back end of November and Christmas, of course, at the back end of December. And if families are at home and they can work from home, if their children can study from at home, then do they need to be in their home, or will they elongate and extend their Christmas, Thanksgiving period? And we're seeing a huge spike in the sort of interest in that here. Examples of that, I use Airbnb for the second time, but pivoting and showing monthly stays as an example to help on that, or Hyatt offering $59 day office room rate hireage as an example of that. So these are different things about how people have taken these consumer changes, understood what they mean and how long they will last, and reacting accordingly. So I'll finish with a couple of things, right? The time period for your market might change, but to be honest, broadly, they're the same as these. Right? We spent February to April in this anxiety mode, right? And all our searches, or disproportionately, were around stockpiling. We watched the news and followed the news like never before, and closures and things like that. We then started to adjust a little bit as we moved through that human side of uncertainty. And the searches we saw pivoted a little bit to at-home gyms, DIY, Zoom, a lot, laptops, pickup, things like that. But where we sit now, it really is this, we kind of call it this life after sweatpants. In fact, I say to my team regularly, you should put pants with a belt on once a week to make sure you're not just wearing elastic waist shorts all day, every day, right, like I am now. So this life after sweatpants, where we're starting to adjust to what will be, whether we want to accept or not, our norm for some time. In my opinion, we've got at least 12 months of this to go. Right? And we're starting to look more at immunity, staycation, think about how we look after our own health and our own well-being. And we're starting to think about what will this look like as we think about the future of different things coming through. I show you this for two reasons. One, and this piece is in many ways some good news. When it all kicked off, right, in the first quarter of this year, we saw a 250% rise year on year of searches that included, is it safe? Is it safe to fly, to travel, to order food? Right? The vast majority of our is it safe queries related to the industry that we live in and work in. But the good news is month on month, they are dropping. Not only are the total number of is it safe queries dropping, but the portion that make up travel and tourism is dropping faster. And we're seeing people start to think more around though going out, drinking, and doing other activities. So they're becoming more personalized in what is safe for them. Perhaps part of that's because they're not considering travel, but I think part of it's because they are starting to think of it in different ways as well. But what we are seeing is people thinking about, is it worth it? I showed you this link when I spoke to some of you last time. In the top right, you can see the mobility link, or you can simply search for COVID-19 mobility. You'll find that. I would urge you to look at that for your market. Let me tell you a few reasons why. I've told you that most of your tourism, most of your business will come locally or domestically. So these will help you in any given region, not only by country, but by area within country, to start to see what the mobility numbers look like. We know that a precursor to travel will be people willing to do retail and recreational activities. So for example, in a country like Mexico, even where some of the lockdowns have eased, there is still a 40% greater reluctance to do retail and recreation than there was a year ago. As we see that reduce or improve, we will start to see travel improve as well. And so that link is a wonderful way to be able to see for your market and for your travelers, what is their willingness, what is their worth it factor on getting outside and doing activities. And as I said, it would be a precursor to travel from there.